The sound that echoed through Bryan County Courthouse wasn't the bang of a gavel. It was laughter. Cold, cutting laughter from the bench aimed at a 72-year-old woman whose only crime was seeking warmth. Judge Martin Hale thought he knew exactly how this case would end. Another quick dismissal, another forgotten face. But he had no idea who was about to walk through those courtroom doors. Stay until the end of the story and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Ruth's journey travels. Ruth Alvarez's hands trembled as she gripped the plastic grocery bag containing everything that mattered anymore. A water-damaged lease agreement from 1979. Her husband's VA hospital discharge papers, a single photograph of their house on Maple Street, the house that no longer belonged to her, and 3 letters from Harborview residences confirming 15 years of employment. Not just employment. 15 years of mopping their marble floors until they gleamed of scrubbing their brass fixtures, until she could see her own tired reflection of arriving at 5 a.m. so the residents would wake to fresh coffee and spotless lobbies. The bag crinkled too loudly in the silence of courtroom 4. Ruth tried to steady it, but her arthritis had other plans. The documents rustled again, and she saw Judge Hale's eyes flick toward the sound with undisguised irritation. Ms. Alvarez. He said her name flat in his mouth like something distasteful. Do you understand the charges against you? Ruth stood straighter, though her back screamed in protest. 72 years of standing cleaning carrying her spine, remembered every one of them. Yes, Your Honor. Criminal trespass. But if I could just explain... I've heard explanations all morning. Judge Martin Hale leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. He was a man who prided himself on efficiency, on clearing his docket by lunch, on not letting sentiment clog the machinery of justice. His courtroom had a reputation: get in, get out, don't waste the judge's time. The building manager called the police. You were sleeping in the lobby of Harborview residences, private property, past midnight. That's trespass. Fairly straightforward. Your Honor, I worked there for 15 years. I just needed. The judge's eyebrow arched. Around the courtroom, the handful of attorneys waiting for their cases looked up from their phones. The court reporter's fingers paused over her keys. Ms. Alvarez, I don't doubt you've had difficulties. At your age, who hasn't? But this court deals in law, not need. Ruth felt heat rise to her cheeks. Not anger, not yet, but something deeper. Shame. The kind of shame that comes from being reduced, from being made small in a room designed to make you feel exactly that way. I understand the law, Your Honor, but I was seeking shelter. The lobby was warm, and I thought maybe because I'd worked there so long, because I'd given them sob stories. The words came out quickly, almost casually, as if Judge Hale were commenting on the weather. But then he did something that would change everything. He laughed. Not a full laugh, not a belly laugh, but a short, derisive chuckle that carried perfectly in the acoustics of the courtroom. Your Honor. Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Ms. Alvarez, but if I let every person with a sob story slide, we'd have no laws at all, would we? You're not the first person to sleep somewhere they shouldn't. You won't be the last. The question is, did you commit the offense or not? The bailiff, a young man named Marcus Chen, who'd been working the courthouse for only 6 months, shifted uncomfortably by the door. He'd seen Judge Hale's efficiency before, had admired it, even the way the judge could cut through nonsense and keep things moving. But this felt different. This felt wrong. Ruth's fingers tightened on her plastic bag. Inside the photograph of her house on Maple Street pressed against the VA papers. She thought of Thomas, her husband, who'd survived 3 tours in Vietnam, only to lose his final battle with cancer 18 months ago. She thought of the medical bills that had arrived like an invading army. $47,000, $89,000, $126,000, numbers so large they stopped meaning anything except unpayable. She thought of the home equity loan they'd taken out, the desperate attempt to save his life, that had ended up costing them everything else. I did sleep there, Your Honor. I'm not denying that. But I'm asking for mercy. I'm asking you to see. I see a woman who broke the law. Judge Hale's voice was sharper now, his patience clearly thinning. I see someone who frankly should know better at your age, should have planned better, should have saved better, should have made better choices. The words landed like slaps. Should have, should have, should have. Ruth had heard those words before from the bank officer who'd explained the foreclosure from her daughter, who'd begged her to move in, but whose apartment was too small, whose husband was too proud, whose life was too full, from the social worker who'd handed her a photocopied list of shelters, all full, all with waiting lists, all requiring you to give up your dignity at the door. Your Honor, Ruth said, and her voice carried a strength that surprised even her. I did plan. I worked for 43 years. I saved what I could. I made the choice to try to save my husband's life. If that was wrong, then I'm guilty of loving someone. But I'm not guilty of being lazy or stupid or careless. For a moment, just a flicker, something crossed Judge Hale's face. Recognition, perhaps. The ghost of his own mother, who died in a nursing home he could barely afford. The memory of his own father, who'd worked himself to death and left nothing but pride and medical debt. But the moment passed. Ms. Alvarez, I'm going to give you a choice. You can plead guilty, pay a fine of $200, and walk out of here. Or you can waste more of this court's time with your explanations, and I'll increase that fine. Your call. $200. Ruth almost laughed herself. She had $17.33 in her purse. She had a suitcase in a storage locker that cost $20 a month, a bill she was 3 months behind on. She had a sister in Florida who'd stopped returning her calls. She had everything and nothing all at once. Your Honor, I don't have $200. That's why I was sleeping in the lobby. Then you'll have 30 days to pay it, or face additional penalties. How do you plead? The courtroom felt smaller, suddenly the walls pressing in. Ruth looked around at the seal of the state hanging behind the judge, at the American flag in the corner, the same flag they'd draped over Thomas's casket, at the empty gallery benches where justice was supposed to be witnessed, but rarely was. I need a moment, Your Honor. You've had plenty of moments, Ms. Alvarez. I have 18 more cases this morning, guilty or not guilty. That's when it happened. The sound was subtle at first, the double doors at the back of the courtroom opening with a pneumatic sigh. Marcus the bailiff turned automatically, his hand moving by instinct toward his belt, though there was no threat. The woman who entered didn't rush. She didn't need to. Vivian Cole moved like someone who'd spent 40 years walking into rooms and changing them simply by being present. She was 68, though she carried it like armor. Her charcoal suit was impeccable, her silver hair cut sharp at her shoulders, her leather briefcase worn but expensive. Behind her, a younger woman in a navy dress fumbled with a notepad. Judge Hale's head snapped up. This is a closed proceeding. Public courtroom, Your Honor. Vivian's voice was smooth, professional, the kind of voice that had negotiated million-dollar real estate deals and stared down city councils. I'm here to address the court regarding this case. You're not the defendant's attorney. No, Your Honor, I'm the person whose life she saved. The courtroom went absolutely still. Ruth's eyes widened. She knew that face, older now, different but unmistakable. Mrs. Cole, Vivian Cole, the woman whose husband, Richard Cole, had collapsed in the lobby of Harborview Residences 7 years ago. Ruth had been waxing the floor, 6:47 a.m. She remembered the exact time because she'd checked before calling 911 when Richard Cole had stumbled out of the elevator clutching his chest. She'd dropped her mop, had run to him, had remembered the CPR training from a community class she'd taken 15 years earlier. She'd pumped his chest. 1, 2, 3. 4. Had breathed into his mouth, had kept going, even when her own arms screamed, even when she thought it was too late. The paramedics had arrived in 9 minutes. Richard Cole had survived. Vivian had sent her flowers, a card, a bonus in her paycheck. And then life had moved on. Your Honor. Vivian continued moving toward the bar with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms as an expert witness, a property owner, a woman who understood that power was often about who spoke last. I'd like to present some context for this case. Judge Hale's face flushed. Ms. Cole, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'm doing what should have been done before Ms. Alvarez was laughed at in a court of law. Vivian's voice didn't rise, but it cut. I'm providing the context that turns this from a trespass case into a failure of human decency. The prosecutor, a tired-looking woman named Jessica Brennan, who'd been half listening while reviewing her next file, sat up straighter. This was irregular. This was, Your Honor. I object to this, whatever this is. Jessica stood, but her objection sounded uncertain even to her own ears. Overruled, Judge Hale said automatically, then seemed to realize what he'd just done. I mean, Ms. Cole, you can't just waltz into my courtroom and what Your Honor provide testimony offer, evidence speak to the character of the defendant, all of which are permitted under the rules of criminal procedure that I assume you're familiar with. Vivian reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. She didn't hand it to anyone yet. She simply held it, and somehow that made it more powerful. Ruth Alvarez worked at Harborview Residences, which my company Cole Urban Partners owned, until we sold it 3 years ago for 15 years. Not 14. Not 16. 15 years exactly. I have the employment records right here. In that time, she called in sick exactly twice. She received 17 letters of commendation from residents. She was Employee of the Month 19 times. And in February 2018, she saved my husband's life. Ruth felt tears building, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of the judge who'd laughed at her. That's very touching, Judge Hale said, his voice tight. But it doesn't change the fact that she committed. Let me finish, Your Honor. Vivian's voice was steel wrapped in silk. After saving my husband's life, Ruth continued working at Harborview. She continued showing up at 5 a.m. She continued being the kind of employee that any business would treasure. And then her husband, Thomas Alvarez, Marine Corps, 3 tours in Vietnam, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The folder opened. Papers rustled. The medical bills totaled $417,000. Their insurance covered 62%. That left a balance of $158,460. They took out a home equity loan against a house they'd owned for 41 years. A house they'd almost finished paying off. They drained their retirement. They sold everything that wasn't nailed down. And Thomas died anyway on March 3rd of last year. Ruth's breath caught. Hearing it laid out like that, hearing her life reduced to numbers and dates, it should have felt clinical. But somehow, coming from Vivian, it felt like someone was finally seeing her. The bank foreclosed 8 months ago. Ruth lost the house on Maple Street, the house where she'd raised her daughter, the house where she'd planned to grow old. And she became homeless at 72 years old. Not because she was lazy, not because she was irresponsible, but because she loved her husband more than she loved a roof over her head. Judge Hale's jaw was tight. Around the courtroom, the other attorneys had stopped pretending to work. The court reporter was openly staring. Marcus the bailiff had tears in his eyes. Now, Vivian said, and her voice carried a weight that made everyone lean forward. "I'm not here to ask for pity. I'm here to ask for justice, real justice. The kind that recognizes that this woman standing before you isn't a criminal. She's a casualty of a system that punishes poverty and rewards wealth." "Ms. Cole," Judge Hale started. "I'm not finished, Your Honor." And then Vivian did something that would become legendary in Bryan County legal circles. She turned to the back of the courtroom and nodded. The doors opened again. This time, 3 people entered. The first was a woman in her early 40s, Asian American with sharp eyes and a recorder in her hand. Naomi Chen, senior investigative reporter for the Bryan County Tribune. She'd broken the story on judicial misconduct in the Eastern District. She'd won a Pulitzer for her series on sentencing disparities. And she was recording everything. The second was an older woman, Vietnamese, in a gray suit, with a state seal pin on her lapel. Commissioner Lila Nguyen, State Judicial Review Board. The person who investigated judges. The person who could end careers. The third was a man in his 50s, black with federal presence written all over him. Attorney General Daniel Park, who'd made his name prosecuting civil rights violations and had recently announced a statewide investigation into courtroom bias. Judge Martin Hale went pale. "Your Honor," Vivian said quietly, "I believe you have some decisions to make, and I believe the record should reflect everything that happens next." Ruth stood there, her plastic bag still clutched in her arthritic hands. And for the first time in 18 months, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. The courtroom had changed. The case had changed. The judge had changed, though he didn't know it yet. Justice, Ruth thought, sometimes arrives when someone decides to walk in. And Vivian Cole had just walked in. The silence that followed was the kind that made people forget to breathe. Judge Martin Hale's face had gone from pale to gray, the color of old concrete. His eyes darted between Vivian Cole and the 3 people who'd just entered, the reporter with her recorder held high like a weapon, the state commissioner with her arms crossed and expression unreadable, the attorney general whose very presence seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Ruth's knees almost gave out. She reached for the defendant's table to steady herself, and Vivian was there instantly, a firm hand on her elbow. "Breathe, Ruth," Vivian whispered. "Just breathe." Marcus the bailiff looked at Judge Hale, waiting for orders that didn't come. The judge's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Finally, words emerged, thin and strained. "This is highly irregular. Commissioner Nguyen, Attorney General Park. I don't know what you think you're witnessing here, but what we're witnessing," Daniel Park said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "is a public court proceeding, unless you're planning to close the courtroom." He let the question hang there, a challenge wrapped in politeness. Judge Hale's hand moved toward his gavel, then stopped. Closing the courtroom now would be an admission, a confirmation that something needed hiding. He was trapped, and he knew it. Naomi Chen, the Tribune reporter, had moved to the side of the courtroom, her recorder capturing everything, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. She'd covered enough court cases to recognize the exact moment when power shifted, and she was watching that moment unfold like a car crash in slow motion. "Your Honor, Jessica Brennan." The prosecutor stood up again. Her voice was shaky. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess to..." "To what, Ms. Brennan?" Vivian turned to face her. "To discuss how to minimize the damage, to figure out how to make this look less like what it actually is." Jessica flinched. She'd been a prosecutor for 11 years, had put away murderers and drug dealers and white-collar criminals, but she'd never felt quite this exposed. "Ms. Cole, I'm just trying to..." "You're trying to do your job. I understand. But your job, as I understand it, is to seek justice, not convictions. Is that not correct?" The question was a trap, and everyone knew it. "Yes," Jessica said quietly. then perhaps you should ask yourself, is justice served by fining a 72-year-old homeless woman $200 for seeking shelter in a building where she worked for 15 years? Is that what justice looks like to you? Jessica sat down without answering. Commissioner Nguyen moved closer to the bench, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She didn't speak, but she pulled out a small notebook and began writing. The sound of her pen scratching paper was somehow louder than anything else in the room. Judge Hale found his voice again, and with it a desperate kind of authority. Ms. Cole, you've made your point. You've provided context. The court appreciates your testimony regarding Ms. Alvarez's character. But this doesn't change the fundamental facts of the case. She was found sleeping in a private building at 1:47 a.m. The building manager reported it as trespassing. The law is clear. The law is clear, Vivian agreed. But the application of the law requires discretion. It requires wisdom. It requires compassion. And it requires judges who don't laugh at the people who appear before them. The words landed like a hammer strike. Judge Hale's face flushed red. I did not. That's a mischaracterization. Your Honor. Marcus the bailiff spoke up suddenly, his voice cracking. Everyone turned to look at him. Your Honor, I was standing right here. You did laugh. I heard it. The judge's eyes went wide. Marcus, you are out of line. No, sir. I'm sorry, but I can't just stand here and pretend I didn't hear what I heard. Marcus looked at Ruth, then back at the judge. My grandmother is 74. If someone laughed at her in a courtroom, I'd want someone to speak up. So I'm speaking up. Commissioner Nguyen wrote faster. Naomi Chen's recorder was going to need new batteries at this rate. Attorney General Park remained perfectly still, but a slight smile played at the corner of his mouth. This was better than he could have hoped for. He'd come here on a tip from Vivian Cole. They'd served together on a housing commission 15 years ago, expecting to observe a pattern of bias. Instead, he was watching it confess itself. Your Honor, Vivian said, and her voice was gentler now, almost kind. I'm not here to destroy you. I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here because systems don't change themselves. People change them. And right now, in this moment, you have a choice. Judge Hale gripped the bench. His knuckles were white. What choice? You can dig in. You can defend your laugh, your dismissal, your efficiency. You can make this about your authority and your courtroom and your reputation. Or, Vivian paused, letting the word stretch out. Or you can recognize that Ruth Alvarez isn't the problem. She's the symptom. And you can be part of the solution. What solution? The judge's voice was barely above a whisper. Vivian opened her briefcase again and pulled out a second folder, this one thicker. I've spent the last 3 weeks analyzing court records from this jurisdiction. Would you like to know what I found? No one answered, but no one looked away either. Elderly defendants in this courthouse are fined at a rate 23% higher than younger defendants for identical offenses. Indigent defendants, those who can't afford private attorneys, receive harsher sentences in 71% of comparable cases. And defendants charged with poverty-related crimes, trespassing, loitering theft under $50, almost never receive social service referrals before they're punished. She pulled out a page and held it up. This is Emma Rodriguez, age 68, fined $300 for sleeping in her car. This is James Butler, 71, jailed for 3 days for trespassing in a library. This is Marie Washington, 66, given a criminal record for shoplifting a $5 package of cheese because she was hungry. Each name hung in the air like an accusation. And this, Vivian said, pulling out a final page, is the pattern, the undeniable statistical documented pattern of this courthouse treating poverty like a crime and age like a liability. Ruth felt something breaking open inside her chest. All this time, she'd thought it was just her bad luck, her poor choices, her failure to navigate a system that seemed designed to grind her down. But it wasn't just her. It had never been just her. Judge Hale was staring at the papers in Vivian's hand like they were snakes. Those are individual cases. Context matters. Circumstances. Exactly, Vivian said. Context matters. Circumstances matter. Which is why I'm confused about why Ruth's context and circumstances didn't seem to matter to you 3 minutes ago. The trap closed. Commissioner Nguyen looked up from her notebook. Your Honor, I'm going to need to see your docket for the past 18 months. All cases involving defendants over 65. All poverty-related offenses. And I'm going to need the recordings from this courtroom for the past week. Judge Hale's voice cracked. Commissioner, I've served on this bench for 14 years. I have a spotless record. Had. Attorney General Park corrected quietly. You had a spotless record. As of approximately 4 minutes ago, that changed. Ruth watched the judge's face crumble, and despite everything, despite the humiliation, despite the laugh, despite the casual cruelty, she felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. This man had probably never meant to become this. He'd probably started out idealistic, believing in justice and fairness. But somewhere along the way, efficiency had replaced empathy. Speed had replaced substance. And he'd forgotten that every case was a life. What do you want from me? Judge Hale's question was directed at Vivian, but it felt like he was asking the universe. Vivian closed her folder. I want you to do what you should have done from the beginning. I want you to see Ruth Alvarez. Really see her. And then I want you to help us fix the system that brought her here. Fix the system. The judge's laugh was bitter now, nothing like the casual cruelty from before. I'm one judge in one courthouse. I can't fix. You can start, Vivian interrupted. Right here, right now. You can start by dismissing these charges. You can start by apologizing to Ruth. And you can start by agreeing to work with the Attorney General's office, with Commissioner Nguyen, with community advocates to develop new protocols. Jessica Brennan stood up slowly. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to move to dismiss the charges against Ms. Alvarez. Judge Hale's head snapped toward her. What? I've heard the testimony. I've seen the context. I don't believe the interests of justice are served by pursuing this case. I move to dismiss with prejudice. The words came out steady clear. Jessica had spent 11 years learning to read rooms, to calculate angles, to play the game. But this wasn't a game anymore. This was about whether she could look at herself in the mirror tomorrow morning. Commissioner Nguyen made a note. Attorney General Park nodded slightly. Naomi Chen's recorder kept spinning. Judge Hale looked around his courtroom, his kingdom, his domain, the place where he'd held absolute power for 14 years, and realized that power had been an illusion all along. Real power was walking through the door behind Vivian Cole. Real power was a bailiff who found his conscience. Real power was a prosecutor who chose justice over a conviction rate. Motion granted, he said finally. Charges dismissed. Ruth's legs did give out then. Vivian caught her, guided her into a chair. The plastic bag fell to the floor, documents spilling across the tiles, the old lease, the VA papers, the photograph of Maple Street. But Ruth was free. The word felt strange in her mouth. Free. She'd been free before, technically, but this was different. This was freedom that came with witness, with documentation, with people who decided that her life mattered. Your Honor, Attorney General Park said, stepping forward, I appreciate the dismissal, but Ms. Cole is right. This is about more than one case. I'd like to propose an immediate meeting in chambers. You, me, Commissioner Nguyen, Ms. Cole, and representatives from the city's social services department. We need protocols. We need systematic change. Judge Hale looked like he wanted to refuse. Every instinct probably screamed at him to defend his territory, to protect his authority. But he'd seen the recorder in Naomi Chen's hand. He'd seen the notebook in Commissioner Nguyen's. He'd seen the future, and it was accountability. 1 hour, he said. I need 1 hour to clear my head. 30 minutes, Park countered. We'll meet in chambers at 10:30. And Your Honor, I strongly suggest you use those 30 minutes to think very carefully about what justice actually means. The Attorney General turned and walked out, Commissioner Nguyen following. Naomi Chen lingered, her eyes meeting Ruth's for a moment. There was a question there. Can I talk to you? And Ruth nodded slightly. Later, when her hands stopped shaking, the courtroom began to empty. The other attorneys gathered their files and left quickly, already mentally composing the stories they'd tell at lunch, the gossip that would spread through the legal community like wildfire. Marcus the bailiff approached Ruth, his young face earnest and worried. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner. Ruth reached out and patted his hand. Her fingers were bent with arthritis, spotted with age, but they were steady. You spoke up when it mattered, son. That's what counts. Jessica Brennan approached next, her professional armor visibly cracked. Ms. Alvarez, I should have looked at your file more closely. I should have asked questions. I just assumed. We all assume, Ruth said quietly. I assumed this courthouse would help me. You assumed I was just another case number. The judge assumed my life didn't matter. We were all wrong about something. Jessica nodded, blinking back tears, and left. Finally, the courtroom was nearly empty. Just Ruth, Vivian, and Judge Hale, who still sat on his bench like a king whose kingdom had turned to sand. Vivian helped Ruth gather her documents, carefully sliding them back into the plastic bag. Are you okay? She asked softly. Ruth thought about the question. Was she okay? She was still homeless, still broke, still grieving Thomas, still facing a world that seemed designed to crush people like her. But something had shifted. Something had broken open. I don't know, she answered honestly. But I'm here. I'm still here. Judge Hale cleared his throat. Both women looked up at him. He'd stepped down from the bench and looked smaller, somehow more human. Miss Alvarez. He began, then stopped, started again. Ruth, I owe you an apology. Ruth waited. I've been on this bench for 14 years, and somewhere along the way, I forgot that every case is a person. I forgot that context matters. I forgot that my job isn't just to enforce the law, it's to serve justice. And justice requires seeing people as they are, not as statistics or case numbers. He paused, his voice thick. I laughed at you. I diminished your suffering. I treated your life as an inconvenience. And I'm sorry. Deeply, truly sorry. The apology hung in the air between them. Ruth studied his face, looking for insincerity, for the performance of contrition. But what she saw was something else: recognition. The recognition that comes when you finally see yourself clearly and don't like what you find. I accept your apology, Ruth said. Not because she had to, not because it would change anything that had already happened, but because grace, she'd learned, wasn't about the person receiving it. It was about the person giving it. But Judge Hale, don't just apologize to me. Apologize to Emma Rodriguez and James Butler and Marie Washington. Apologize to everyone who sat where I sat and got crushed by this system. Judge Hale nodded, his eyes wet. I will. I promise you I will. Vivian put her hand on Ruth's shoulder. Come on, let's get you out of here. They walked toward the doors, Ruth's arthritic hip aching with each step her plastic bag clutched to her chest. But before they could leave, Vivian turned back to the judge. Your Honor, one more thing. That meeting in chambers, I'm going to push for some very specific changes. Mandatory needs assessments for any defendant over 65. Social service referrals before fines for poverty-related offenses. A specialized docket for housing and homelessness cases with trained mediators. And a redirect of court fees into an emergency senior housing fund. Judge Hale's eyes widened. That's extensive. That's necessary, Vivian finished. That's necessary, and you're going to help make it happen. Because right now, you have a choice: be remembered as the judge who laughed at a homeless grandmother, or be remembered as the judge who helped change the system. Which legacy do you want? The judge had no answer. Vivian and Ruth walked out of Courtroom 4 into the marble corridor of Bryan County Courthouse. Ruth's legs were shaking, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. Why? She asked, suddenly stopping in the middle of the hallway. Why did you do this? You barely knew me. Richard recovered 7 years ago. You could have just moved on. Vivian smiled, and it was sad and knowing and fierce all at once. You want to know a secret, Ruth? I was you. Not homeless, not exactly, but crushed by the system. After Richard's heart attack, after his recovery, we thought we were safe. But then he developed complications, more surgeries, more bills. We had money, thank God, but I watched it drain away. I watched us become vulnerable. And I learned something: being one bad month away from disaster is a club nobody wants to join, but millions of us are members. Ruth's eyes widened. She'd assumed Vivian was untouchable, unreachable, living in a world where medical bills and foreclosures and sleeping in lobbies were foreign concepts. But you have a company. You have... Now, yes. After Richard died, I rebuilt. But I remember what it felt like to be afraid, to be one step away from losing everything. And I promised myself that if I ever got the chance to change things, I would. Vivian's voice was fierce. You saved Richard's life. You gave me 4 more years with my husband. 4 more years of mornings and laughter and ordinary moments. I can't give you your house back. I can't bring Thomas back. But I can give you this: I can make sure your suffering meant something. I can make sure the system that broke you starts to bend. They stood in the courthouse hallway, 2 women from different worlds who'd been brought together by crisis and CPR, and the simple fact that compassion doesn't have a price tag. What happens now? Ruth asked. Vivian checked her watch. Now we have 23 minutes before that meeting in chambers. Let's get you some coffee, something to eat, and a chance to breathe. Then we're going to walk back in there and negotiate the future. I don't know how to negotiate the future. Yes, you do, Vivian said firmly. You've been negotiating for survival every day. This is just survival on a bigger scale. They walked toward the courthouse cafeteria, an unlikely pair, the CEO and the homeless woman, the saved and the saver. 2 women who discovered that sometimes justice doesn't arrive on schedule. Sometimes it has to be summoned. Sometimes it has to be demanded. And sometimes it walks through the door when someone decides to stop accepting the world as it is and starts fighting for the world as it should be. Behind them in Courtroom 4, Judge Martin Hale sat alone on his bench, staring at the empty room, and wondered how 14 years of good intentions had led him to this moment. How efficiency had become cruelty. How certainty had become blindness. In chambers, Attorney General Park was already making calls, setting wheels in motion that couldn't be stopped. In the hallway, Naomi Chen was typing notes on her phone, crafting the lead for a story that would make front-page news and wouldn't stop there. And somewhere in Bryan County, in warm lobbies and cold shelters and cars parked on side streets, 73 other elderly people were sleeping, unaware that their lives were about to change, because one woman had refused to accept that context didn't matter, because one CEO had decided that gratitude meant action, because one bailiff had found his voice at exactly the right moment. Ruth sipped bad courthouse coffee and thought about Thomas, about how he'd always said that the measure of a society wasn't how it treated its best citizens, but how it treated its most vulnerable. The courthouse clock struck 10:15. In 15 minutes, the real work would begin. The coffee was terrible, but Ruth drank it anyway, letting the bitter warmth spread through her chest. She sat at a small table in the courthouse cafeteria, watching lawyers in expensive suits grab muffins and gossip, unaware that the world had just shifted on its axis, one floor above them. Vivian was on her phone, speaking in low, clipped tones to someone about zoning regulations and emergency protocols, her free hand making sharp gestures in the air like she was conducting an invisible orchestra. Ruth's fingers trembled around the styrofoam cup. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind exhaustion so profound it felt like gravity had doubled. She looked at the clock on the wall, 10:17. 13 minutes until they walked back into chambers. 13 minutes until she had to be strong again. Ruth. Vivian hung up and sat down across from her. I need to prepare you for what's about to happen in that room. More people staring at me like I'm a problem to solve. Vivian's expression softened. Some of them, yes. But we're going to change what kind of problem you represent. Right now, to the system, you're a failure, someone who fell through the cracks. But we're going to make you a mirror. We're going to make them see that every policy, every fine, every dismissive laugh creates 1,000 more Ruths. And we're going to make them understand that they can't afford that anymore. Ruth set down her coffee. I'm not a mirror, Vivian. I'm just a woman who lost everything. You're both, Vivian said firmly. And that's what makes this powerful. You're specific, your story, your loss, your husband, your house on Maple Street. But you're also universal. Every person in this courthouse knows someone like you. A mother, a grandmother, a neighbor who worked hard and still ended up with nothing. That's the bridge we're going to build in that room. The cafeteria door opened, and Commissioner Nguyen walked in, scanning the room until her eyes landed on their table. She approached with the measured steps of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating political minefields. Ms. Cole, Ms. Alvarez. She pulled out a chair without waiting for an invitation. We need to talk before that meeting. Vivian's eyes narrowed. About expectations, about what's realistic. Commissioner Nguyen pulled out her notebook, flipped to a marked page. I've been reviewing Judge Hale's record. 14 years on the bench, generally fair if a bit harsh on sentencing. No prior complaints, no disciplinary actions. What happened this morning was egregious, yes, but it was also, arguably, a one-time lapse in judgment. Ruth felt her stomach drop. You're going to protect him. I'm going to be realistic. Nguyen corrected her voice, not unkind. The Judicial Review Board can sanction him. We can mandate training. We can put him on probation. But removing him, that requires a pattern of misconduct, and we don't have that. Not yet. Not yet. Vivian leaned forward. Commissioner, you heard him laugh at a homeless woman. You heard his bailiff confirm it. You have it on record. I have one incident on record, Nguyen said. And I have a judge who by all accounts has served competently for over a decade. The board will take this seriously, but they won't end his career over it unless we can demonstrate systematic abuse. Ruth watched Vivian's face harden, saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. This was the game then. The real game. Not the drama of the courtroom, but the grinding bureaucracy of change. Then we use this incident as leverage, Vivian said slowly. We don't push for removal. We push for transformation. Judge Hale becomes the poster child for reform, not as punishment, but as redemption. He helps us build the new protocols. He trains other judges. He becomes the example of how the system can fix itself. Nguyen's expression shifted, something like respect flickering across her face. That could work, if he's willing. He's willing, Vivian said with certainty. He's terrified, and shame is a powerful motivator. We saw that in his face. He knows his legacy hangs in the balance. And what about her legacy? Ruth's voice was quiet, but it cut through the conversation like a blade. Both women turned to look at her. What about all the other people who sat in that courtroom and got crushed? What about Emma Rodriguez and James Butler and Marie Washington? Do they get redemption, or just Judge Hale? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and accusatory. Nguyen closed her notebook slowly. Ms. Alvarez, I understand your anger. Do you? Ruth's hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time. Do you understand what it's like to stand in front of someone who has all the power and be told your life is just a sob story? Do you understand what it's like to lose everything and then be laughed at for seeking shelter? Do you understand? Her voice cracked. Do you understand what it's like to be invisible until suddenly you're useful? The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Vivian reached across the table, covered Ruth's trembling hands with her own. You're not useful, Ruth. You're essential. There's a difference. Is there? Ruth pulled her hands away, not in anger, but in a desperate need to hold on to something, even if it was just her own grief. Because it feels like I matter now, only because you walked through that door. It feels like my suffering only counts because you decided to count it. Nguyen's face was unreadable, but something shifted in her eyes, a recognition perhaps of her own complicity in systems that only noticed pain when it was witnessed by the right people. You're right, the commissioner said finally. You're absolutely right. And I can't fix that. I can't make the system see you the way it should have from the beginning. But I can use my position to make sure it starts seeing others. That's not justice, Ms. Alvarez. That's just damage control. But it's what I have to offer. Ruth looked at this woman, this powerful woman, with her state seal pin and her authority, and saw something she hadn't expected: honesty. Not comfort, not platitudes, but the raw admission that the system was broken, and even those inside it knew it. Damage control, Ruth repeated. My whole life reduced to damage control. No, Vivian said sharply. Your life is your life, the 43 years of work, the marriage, the daughter, the house on Maple Street, the morning you saved Richard's life. That's yours, and no one can reduce it. What we're talking about is what comes next. What we build from this moment. And yes, it starts with damage control, but it doesn't end there. The cafeteria clock showed 10:24, 6 minutes. Nguyen stood up. Attorney General Park wants to propose a 3-phase approach in chambers. Immediate reforms for this courthouse. Pilot program expansion to 3 other districts. Then, if successful, statewide legislation. It's ambitious. It'll take years, but it starts today in that room with what Judge Hale is willing to commit to. And if he's not willing, Ruth asked. Then I have enough for a formal investigation, Nguyen said. And Naomi Chen has enough for a story that will make his life very difficult. But that's the scorched earth option. That's the option where we punish one judge and change nothing else. I'd rather build something. She walked away, leaving Ruth and Vivian alone again. I don't know if I can do this, Ruth whispered. Go back in there and sit across from him and negotiate like any of this is normal. Vivian's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, typed something quickly, then set it down. Nothing about this is normal, Ruth. That's exactly why it matters. Normal is what got us here. The normal callousness, the normal indifference, the normal efficiency that forgets about humanity. What we're about to do is radically abnormal. We're going to sit across from a judge who wronged you and demand that he help us fix the system that enabled that wrong. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, but it's how change happens. Ruth thought about Thomas, about the morning he'd told her about his diagnosis. They'd been sitting at their kitchen table on Maple Street, sunlight coming through the window, and he'd said, "We're going to fight this, Ruthie. We're going to fight with everything we have." And they had. They'd fought with love and money and hope and desperation, and they'd lost anyway. But the fighting had mattered. The trying had mattered. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'll do it. But Vivian, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let them make me grateful. Don't let them act like they're doing me a favor. Whatever changes come out of that room, they're not charity. They're what should have existed all along. Can you make sure that's clear?" Vivian's smile was fierce and proud. Crystal clear. They stood up, gathered their things. Ruth's plastic bag felt heavier, somehow weighted with the importance of what it represented. Evidence of a life lived, a life lost, a life that mattered, whether the system acknowledged it or not. The walk back to chambers felt longer than it should have. Each step echoed in the marble hallway. Other people passed them, lawyers, defendants, families, all absorbed in their own dramas, unaware that the architecture of justice was being rewritten just down the hall. Outside the chamber doors, Attorney General Park was waiting, his expression serious. "They're ready for us. Judge Hale, the court administrator, and I've asked the Director of Social Services to join us. That's Margaret Chen, no relation to our reporter friend. She's practical, budget conscious, and she's seen enough elderly people fall through the cracks to be motivated." "How's the judge?" Vivian asked. Park's mouth twitched. Subdued. He knows this is his chance to save his career. He'll cooperate. Whether he'll truly change or just perform change remains to be seen. Ruth straightened her shoulders, felt her spine protest, ignored it. Then let's find out. The chambers were smaller than Ruth expected, lined with law books that probably hadn't been opened in years, dominated by a conference table where 5 people already sat. Judge Hale at the head, his face pale and drawn. Margaret Chen, a woman in her 50s, with tired eyes and capable hands, to his right. The court administrator, a nervous man named Paul, something shuffling papers. Commissioner Nguyen, notebook open. And one empty chair for Vivian. Ruth stood near the door, unsure where she belonged in this configuration of power. "Ms. Alvarez," Judge Hale said, his voice formal but strained. "Please sit." He gestured to a chair next to Vivian's empty one. Ruth sat, her plastic bag on her lap like armor. Attorney General Park closed the door and remained standing, a deliberate choice that made him seem larger, more authoritative. "Let's be clear about why we're here. This morning, we witnessed a failure of compassion, of discretion, of the very principles our justice system is supposed to embody. But we also have an opportunity to transform that failure into something constructive. Judge Hale has agreed to work with us on developing new protocols. The question is, what do those protocols look like, and how quickly can we implement them?" Margaret Chen spoke up, her voice practical and no nonsense. "Before we talk protocols, we need to talk reality. My department is underfunded and overwhelmed. We have 3 caseworkers for every 1,000 seniors in this county. Our emergency housing fund has been depleted since August. If you're asking me to assess every elderly defendant before they're fined, I need resources, not promises, actual money and actual staff. Which is why Vivian said, sitting down and pulling out yet another folder from her seemingly endless briefcase. I'm proposing that we redirect court fees from poverty-related offenses directly into an emergency senior housing fund administered by your department. Currently, those fees go into the general county budget. We change the allocation. Paul, the court administrator, nearly choked. You can't just redirect court fees. That requires county approval budget amendments. Which we'll get, Vivian said calmly. Because the alternative is Naomi Chen's story hitting the Tribune tomorrow morning, followed by a state investigation, followed by a federal civil rights inquiry. The county commission will be very motivated to cooperate. Meh. Ruth watched this negotiation like a chess match played at lightning speed. Each person had their piece, their power, their leverage. Vivian was the queen moving in all directions. Park was the rook, straightforward and powerful. Nguyen was the bishop, moving diagonally through regulation and oversight. And Judge Hale. Judge Hale was the king, powerful in theory, but actually quite vulnerable, trying desperately not to be checkmated. What else? Judge Hale asked, and Ruth could hear the resignation in his voice. He knew he'd already lost. Now, he was just trying to lose gracefully. Mandatory needs assessment for any defendant over 65 charged with poverty-related offenses, Park said. Before fines, before sentencing, a social worker evaluates their situation and provides options: housing assistance, medical care, food security, mental health services. Margaret Chen was already shaking her head. Again, resources. I can't pull social workers out of thin air. You can if we hire them, Vivian said. Cole Urban Partners will fund 3 new social worker positions for the first year. After that, the county takes over funding from the redirected court fees and the savings from reduced recidivism. Ruth's head was spinning. This was happening so fast, money and positions and reforms being thrown around like they were simple, like changing a broken system was just a matter of writing checks and signing papers. Is it always this easy? She asked suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. Is changing things always this easy when the right people are in the room? The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Yes, Commissioner Nguyen said finally. Yes, it is. And that's the problem, Ms. Alvarez. Change shouldn't require a CEO walking through the door. It shouldn't require an attorney general making threats. It shouldn't require a viral news story. But it does. Because systems protect themselves. They resist change until the cost of not changing becomes too high. Ruth felt something hardening in her chest. Something that might have been anger, or might have been understanding, or might have been the awful recognition that she'd been right all along. She only mattered now because Vivian had decided she did. So, what happens to the people without a Vivian Cole? Ruth asked. What happens to the next person like me who shows up in that courtroom? Judge Hale spoke, and his voice was different now. Smaller, more human. That's what these protocols are for, Ms. Alvarez. So that the system sees them even without someone like Ms. Cole. So that I see them. So that I remember. He stopped, swallowed hard. So that I remember that every case is a person. Pretty words, Ruth said, and she wasn't trying to be cruel, but she was so tired of pretty words. But words are cheap. Thomas and I heard pretty words from the bank, from the hospital, from everyone who couldn't actually help us. What are you actually going to do? Judge Hale looked at Attorney General Park, then at Vivian, then back at Ruth. I'm going to create a specialized docket, a housing and homelessness court that meets twice a month. Cases like yours won't be rushed through in 5 minutes. They'll be heard by a judge who's been trained in housing law, elder rights, and trauma-informed practice. They'll have access to mediators, to advocates, to resources. And I'm going to volunteer to be that judge for the first year. I'm going to sit in that specialized court and learn how to do this right. Ruth studied his face, looking for performance, for the careful choreography of a man saving his career. But what she saw looked like genuine remorse, like a person confronting the gap between who he thought he was and who he'd actually become. "And what about Emma Rodriguez?" Ruth pressed. "What about James Butler and Marie Washington and all the others you've already sentenced?" "We review every case," Park said. "Every defendant over 65 sentenced in the past 18 months. We look at their fines, their records, their circumstances. Where appropriate, we vacate sentences, expunge records, and provide retroactive services." Margaret Chen was making calculations on a notepad. "That's at least 200 cases, maybe more. The staff hours alone." "Cole Urban Partners will provide administrative support," Vivian cut in. "We'll assign a paralegal team to help with the case reviews. We'll cover the costs." Ruth's hands tightened on her plastic bag. "Why?" The question burst out of her raw and desperate. "Why are you doing all this? Really?" Vivian met her eyes, and for the first time since walking into that courtroom, Ruth saw something crack in her polished exterior. A grief, old and deep. "Because Richard died 6 months after his heart attack," Vivian said quietly. "Not from his heart. From an infection he got in the hospital during his recovery. A preventable infection if the hospital had been less understaffed, less overwhelmed, less focused on billing than on care. And I sat in meetings just like this one with administrators and lawyers and people with power, and I watched them perform concern. I watched them apologize. I watched them promise to do better. But nothing changed. Nothing fundamental changed." She paused, and Ruth could see her fighting to keep her voice steady. "So when I watched you stand in that courtroom this morning, when I heard that judge laugh at you the way administrators had laughed off my concerns, I saw my chance to make sure something actually changes this time. Not just paperwork changes, not just policy changes. Real change. The kind that means the next Ruth doesn't end up sleeping in a lobby. The kind that means the next Richard doesn't die from a preventable infection. That's why." The room was absolutely silent. Ruth felt tears building, but she refused to let them fall. "Not yet. Not here." "I'm sorry about Richard." "I'm sorry about Thomas," Vivian replied. And in that exchange, something shifted. This wasn't just about protocols and policies anymore. This was about two women who'd lost the men they loved to systems that valued efficiency over humanity, and who'd found each other across that shared grief. "There's one more thing," Ruth said, straightening in her chair. "Whatever we build here, whatever changes we make, I want my name on it. Not for glory, but so people know. So when someone benefits from these protocols, they know it came from someone who suffered. They know it came from someone the system tried to erase." Commissioner Nguyen looked up from her notebook. "The Alvarez Protocols." "The Alvarez Act." Attorney General Park corrected. "If we're going to push this to the state legislature, and we should, it needs to be legislation, not just local policy. The Alvarez Act, protecting elderly defendants from punitive measures without proper assessment and resources." Ruth's breath caught. Her name. In legislation. Thomas would have loved that his Ruthie, the woman who'd scrubbed floors and saved lives and lost everything, becoming the namesake for change. "I'll draft the framework," Park continued. "We'll use these protocols as the foundation. Mandatory needs assessment, social service referrals, specialized courts, redirected fees into housing funds. We'll add protections for other vulnerable populations too. Disabled defendants, veterans, anyone whose poverty is being criminalized. We'll make it comprehensive." "How long?" Vivian asked. "How long until the Alvarez Act becomes real law?" Park's expression was cautious. "Legislation is slow. We're looking at 18 months minimum, possibly 2 years. But the protocols here in Broward County, those we can implement immediately. This courthouse becomes the model. We prove it works, we show the data, and then we take it statewide." Ruth felt the weight of time pressing down. 18 months. 2 years. How many more people would fall through the cracks while they waited? How many more Emmas and Jameses and Marys? Then we move fast on the local implementation, Ruth said, surprised by the authority in her own voice. We make this courthouse prove it works. We document everything. We show that treating people with dignity isn't just moral, it's practical. It saves money. It reduces recidivism. It makes the whole system work better. Margaret Chen was nodding. She's right. If we can show that our elderly defendants stop cycling through the system when we actually address their needs, the budget argument makes itself. County commissioners love anything that saves money. Then we're agreed, Judge Hale said, and he looked around the table as if seeking confirmation that he was still allowed to lead. We implement the protocols starting next week. Specialized docket needs assessment service referrals. We track outcomes religiously, and we use Ms. Alvarez as our compass. If a policy would have helped her, we implement it. If it would have hurt her, we reject it. Is that acceptable? He was looking at Ruth when he asked. She thought about being a compass, a measure, a standard, about her suffering becoming the metric by which justice was calculated. There was something horrible about it, something that made her want to scream that she should never have had to suffer in the first place. But there was also something powerful, something that said her pain wouldn't be wasted, her loss wouldn't be meaningless. Yes, she said, that's acceptable. But I want to be involved. I want to be part of the review team, part of the implementation, not as a victim, as an expert. Because I know more about how this system fails than any of you ever will. Vivian's smile was brilliant. Ruth, how would you feel about a job? The question came out of nowhere, hung in the air like a lifeline. A job. Resident coordinator for a new project I'm developing. Affordable senior housing with wraparound services, medical care, social support, community space. Someone who understands the population, who's lived the struggle, who can help design services that actually work. It's a real position, Ruth. 40 hours a week benefits salary, not charity. Employment. Ruth's mind reeled. A job. After 18 months of being unemployable, of being too old, too broken, too much of a risk. A job that used her experience instead of holding it against her. A job that came with stability, with dignity, with a future that extended beyond the next night's shelter lottery. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Vivian said simply. Say yes, and then we'll find you a place to stay tonight. That isn't a lobby or a shelter. Say yes, and tomorrow we start building Harbor Commons together. Harbor Commons. Even the name felt like a promise. A harbor, a safe place, a commons where people belonged. Ruth looked around the table at these people who hours ago had been strangers, who minutes ago had been adversaries, who now were something like allies. She looked at Judge Hale, who'd wronged her and was trying to make it right. At Commissioner Nguyen, who worked within a broken system but was trying to fix it. At Margaret Chen, who was overwhelmed but still showing up. At Attorney General Park, who wielded power but was trying to use it justly. And she looked at Vivian Cole, who'd walked through a courtroom door and changed everything. Yes, Ruth said. Her voice was steady. Her hands had stopped shaking. Yes, I'll take the job. Yes, I'll help build this. Yes, I'll be part of the solution. But on one condition. Name it, Vivian said. We named the first building after Thomas, the Thomas Alvarez Senior Residence. So everyone knows that this came from love, that it came from a man who served his country and deserved better, that it came from the kind of sacrifice that should never have been necessary, but was. Vivian reached across the table, took Ruth's arthritic hands in hers. Done. The Thomas Alvarez Senior Residence it is. The meeting continued for another hour, hammering out details and timelines and responsibilities. Ruth participated, asked questions, pushed back when something didn't make sense. She was no longer just the defendant, the victim, the problem. She was Ruth Alvarez, resident coordinator expert in system failure and human resilience, co-architect of change. When they finally emerged from chambers, it was nearly noon. The courthouse was busy with the lunch rush, people streaming through, security attorneys meeting clients. The ordinary machinery of justice grinding on, unaware that something had shifted in a small room down the hall. Naomi Chen was waiting in the corridor, her recorder visible in her hand. "Well?" she asked. Vivian smiled. "We have a story for you. But it's not the story of a judge who failed. It's the story of a system that's learning to succeed. Are you interested?" Naomi's eyes gleamed. "I'm very interested." They walked out of Bryan County Courthouse together. Ruth, Vivian, and Naomi into afternoon sunlight that felt warmer than it had any right to be in October. Ruth stood on the courthouse steps, the same steps she'd climbed that morning with dread and desperation, and felt something she hadn't felt in 18 months. She felt like she had a future. The plastic bag was still in her hands, still holding the documents of a life lost. But now it also held something else. A business card from Vivian, with her new job title written on the back in neat script. A promise that change was coming, and the knowledge that sometimes justice doesn't arrive on schedule. Sometimes you have to walk into a courtroom and demand it. Sometimes someone has to walk in behind you and refuse to let you be invisible. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the system breaks open just enough to let the light in. The first night in her own bed, a real bed, not a cot in a shelter or a bench in a lobby, Ruth couldn't sleep. The efficiency apartment Vivian had arranged was small, temporary, a stopgap until Harbor Commons was built, but it had 4 walls and a door that locked from the inside and heat that worked. Ruth lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of safety, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the quiet breathing of a building at rest. She kept waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake, that she had to leave, that she didn't belong here after all. Morning came anyway, indifferent to her fears. Ruth's phone, another gift from Vivian, because how could you coordinate residents without a phone, buzzed at 6:30. A text message. "Coffee at my office, 8 a.m. We have work to do. V." Ruth stood in front of the small bathroom mirror, studying the face looking back at her. 72 years showed in every line, every spot, every sag. But there was something else there too, something she hadn't seen in months. Purpose. She dressed carefully in clothes from the donation bag Vivian had provided, professional, clean, dignified, and caught the bus to Cole Urban Partners downtown. The office was all glass and steel, the kind of place Ruth had only ever entered to clean. But this time, she walked through the front door as an employee. The receptionist, a young man with kind eyes, looked up and smiled. "You must be Ms. Alvarez. Ms. Cole is expecting you. 5th floor, corner office." Ruth rode the elevator up, her reflection multiplying in the mirrored walls. 5 Ruths, 10 Ruths, all of them looking slightly terrified and fiercely determined in equal measure. Vivian's office overlooked the city windows, framing Bryan County like a promise and a challenge. Coffee was already waiting along with someone Ruth didn't recognize, a woman in her 30s with an architect's precise posture and a tablet under her arm. "Ruth, this is Sarah Chen, Margaret's daughter, actually. She's our lead architect for Harbor Commons. Sarah, this is Ruth Alvarez, our resident coordinator." Sarah stood, extended her hand. "My mother told me what happened in court. What you're doing, it's incredible." Ruth shook her hand, uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just trying to make sure other people don't end up where I was." "That's exactly why we need you. Sarah said, gesturing to the tablet. I've designed affordable housing before, but I've never lived it. I need you to tell me what works, what doesn't, what looks good on paper, but fails in practice. For the next 2 hours, they reviewed architectural plans. Ruth pointed out doorways too narrow for walkers, showers without grab bars, kitchens with cabinets mounted too high for arthritic shoulders to reach. She talked about the importance of community space that didn't feel institutional, about gardens where people could grow things and remember what it felt like to nurture life, about mailboxes placed where residents could check them without broadcasting their financial desperation to neighbors. The lobby, Ruth said, studying the central gathering space on the plans. It needs to be warm but not wasteful. Good lighting, comfortable chairs that are easy to get out of. Maybe a coffee station, not fancy, just functional. Because sometimes people need a reason to leave their apartments to see other faces, to remember they're not alone. Sarah was typing notes furiously. What about security locks, cameras? Ruth's jaw tightened. Enough to keep people safe. Not so much that it feels like a prison. We've all been scrutinized enough. We need a home, not another institution monitoring our every move. Vivian watched this exchange with satisfaction. What about the medical clinic? Margaret's department wants to place a nurse practitioner on site 3 days a week. Make it 5, Ruth said immediately. And make sure there's a private exam room. Dignity, always dignity. Old people get treated like children in medical settings, talked over, talked around, never talked to. The clinic needs to respect that these are adults who've lived full lives. The morning flew by in a blur of decisions and revisions. Ruth's input reshaped the entire project. Lowering countertops, widening hallways, adding a child care corner for grand families, creating a computer lab where seniors could learn technology without judgment. Each change was small, but together they transformed Harbor Commons from housing into home. At 11, Vivian's assistant knocked. Ms. Cole, Attorney General Park is online too. Says it's urgent. Vivian picked up the speakerphone. Daniel, what's wrong? Park's voice filled the office tight with controlled anger. Judge Hale just called me. We have a problem. County Commissioner Walsh is blocking the fee redirection. Says it's executive overreach that the court can't just reallocate budget without county approval. He's threatening to sue. Ruth felt her stomach drop. Of course. Of course it couldn't be that simple. Of course someone with power would push back. What's his real objection? Vivian asked, her voice sharp. What do you think the fees from poverty offenses bring in? About $300,000 a year for the general fund. Walsh doesn't want to lose that revenue stream. $300,000, Ruth said quietly. That's what my suffering is worth. That's what all of our suffering is worth. A line item in a budget. Vivian's expression hardened. Can he actually stop us? Legally? Maybe. The county does control budget allocations. But Ruth's right. It's about money, not legality. If we can make the political cost higher than the financial cost, he'll cave. Then we make it costly, Vivian said. She looked at Ruth. How do you feel about telling your story, publicly? Ruth's hands started to shake. To who? To everyone. Press conference. You, me, some of the other seniors we've identified in our case review. We put faces to those $300,000. We make Walsh explain why revenue is more important than human beings. The thought of standing in front of cameras, of exposing her loss and shame to strangers, made Ruth's chest tighten. But then she thought about Emma Rodriguez, about James Butler, about Marie Washington. She thought about all the people still sleeping in lobbies and cars and shelters waiting for a system to notice them. When? Ruth asked. Tomorrow. We need to move fast before Walsh can control the narrative. Can you do it? Ruth thought about Thomas, about how he'd faced enemy fire with his jaw set and his spine straight. She thought about the morning she'd performed CPR on Richard Cole, how her hands had moved without hesitation, even though she was terrified. Courage, she'd learned, wasn't the absence of fear. It was deciding that something mattered more than the fear. Yes, I can do it. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of preparation. Naomi Chen arrived at Cole Urban Partners with a photographer helping Ruth craft her statement. Attorney General Park, joined by video conference coaching her on how to handle hostile questions. Margaret Chen brought 3 other seniors from the case review. Emma Rodriguez, who'd been fined for sleeping in her car. James Butler, who'd been jailed for library trespassing. And Marie Washington, who'd shoplifted cheese to survive. They sat in Vivian's conference room, these 4 people who'd been crushed by the same machinery and shared their stories. Emma's voice cracked when she described watching the police tow her car, her home, because she couldn't pay the compounded fines. James's hands trembled when he talked about the 3 nights in jail, how the cold concrete had aggravated his arthritis, how he'd been too ashamed to call his daughter. Marie stared at the table when she admitted she'd thought about ending it, about walking into traffic, because the humiliation of being labeled a thief at 66 was more than she could bear. But we didn't end it, Ruth said, looking at each of them. We're still here, still fighting. And tomorrow we're going to make sure that fight means something. That evening, back in her temporary apartment, Ruth practiced her statement in front of the mirror. The words felt heavy, significant, like she was carving them into stone rather than just speaking them aloud. My name is Ruth Alvarez. I am 72 years old. I worked for 43 years. I loved my husband for 48 years. I lost everything trying to save his life. And the system I trusted to help me instead laughed at me. She said it again and again until the tremor left her voice, until she could meet her own eyes in the mirror without flinching. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the courthouse steps. A deliberate choice, Vivian explained, to connect Ruth's story to the place where the system had failed her. Ruth barely slept that night, running through her statement, imagining all the ways it could go wrong. Morning arrived cold and bright. Vivian picked Ruth up personally, and they drove to the courthouse in silence. When they pulled up, Ruth saw the crowd already gathering, reporters with cameras and microphones, curious citizens, and standing prominently in front. Commissioner Walsh himself, his face red and his posture aggressive. He's going to try to disrupt this, Vivian said quietly. Don't let him. Tell your truth. That's all you have to do. Ruth stepped out of the car, and immediately the cameras swung toward her. Naomi Chen was already there, along with Emma James and Marie. Attorney General Park stood to the side with Commissioner Nguyen. Judge Hale was conspicuously present too, a visual reminder of the system's failure and potential redemption. Vivian approached the microphones first. Thank you for coming. We're here today to discuss the Alvarez Act and the immediate protocols we've developed to stop criminalizing poverty in Broward County. But before we talk about policy, you need to hear from the people that policy is designed to protect. Ruth stepped forward, and the world seemed to contract to just her and the microphones and the truth she needed to tell. My name is Ruth Alvarez, she began, and her voice was steady. I am 72 years old. I worked for 43 years as a waitress, a home health aide, a custodian. I paid my taxes. I saved what I could. I raised my daughter to believe that if you worked hard and did right, the system would take care of you. She paused, swallowed. The cameras were relentless, but she looked past them to the courthouse behind them. My husband Thomas was a Marine, 3 tours in Vietnam. He came home with scars you could see and scars you couldn't. But he was a good man, a kind man. When he got sick, stage 4, pancreatic cancer, we did what you do when you love someone. We fought. We spent everything we had. We borrowed against our house, and he died anyway. Emma Rodriguez was crying quietly. James Butler had his eyes closed. Marie Washington was gripping the railing like it was all that kept her upright. When the bank foreclosed when I lost the house on Maple Street, where I'd lived for 41 years, I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. The worst was standing in a courtroom asking for help and being laughed at. The worst was being told my life was a sob story that I should have planned better, saved better, been better. Commissioner Walsh tried to interrupt. Ms. Alvarez, with all due respect, this is an emotional appeal that ignores the fiscal. I'm not finished. Ruth's voice cut through his sharp and clear. The crowd went silent. You want to talk about fiscal reality? Commissioner Walsh? Let's talk about it. The court finds elderly people like me, like Emma, like James, like Marie. We can't pay. So the fines compound. Interest accrues. Warrants are issued. We end up in jail, which costs the county $150 per person per day. When we're released, we still can't pay, so the cycle repeats. That's your fiscal reality, spending hundreds of thousands to punish poverty instead of pennies on the dollar to address it. Vivian stepped closer, ready to intervene if needed, but Ruth had found her rhythm. The Alvarez Act isn't charity. It's not a handout. It's a recognition that criminalizing people for being poor costs more in money and human dignity, in the basic moral fabric of our community, than helping them ever would. We're asking the county to redirect $300,000 in court fees into housing and services. You know what that $300,000 represents? It represents fines levied against people who have nothing. It represents profit extracted from suffering. It represents a system that would rather punish than prevent. She turned to face Commissioner Walsh directly. You say the county can't afford to lose that revenue. I say the county can't afford to keep it. Not morally, not practically, not if we want to call ourselves civilized. The silence that followed was profound. Cameras clicked and whirred. Reporters scribbled notes. And Commissioner Walsh's face had gone from red to gray. Naomi Chen stepped forward with a question. Commissioner Walsh, how do you respond to Ms. Alvarez's statement? Walsh looked trapped, caught between his budget concerns and the cameras broadcasting his response to thousands of potential voters. The county has financial obligations. We can't make decisions based on emotion. Based on humanity, you mean? Emma Rodriguez spoke up, her voice stronger than Ruth expected. Say it plain, Commissioner. You can't make decisions based on seeing us as human beings. Walsh sputtered. That's not what I... Then prove it, James Butler said. Prove you see us as people and not line items. Support the Alvarez Act. Support the protocol changes. Show us that $300,000 in fees isn't worth more than $300,000 in human dignity. Marie Washington added quietly, My grandson saw me on the news after I was arrested for stealing cheese. He was 8 years old. He asked me if Grandma was a bad person. What do I tell him, Commissioner? That the county needed the fine money more than his grandma needed to eat. The press conference was slipping away from Walsh, and everyone could see it. Attorney General Park chose that moment to step forward, his federal authority lending weight to what came next. Commissioner Walsh, I want to be clear about something. The fee redirection is one component of the Alvarez Act, but the state is moving forward with or without county cooperation. We have the authority to mandate needs assessments, to require service referrals, to establish specialized courts. Broward County can either lead this change and benefit from the pilot program funding, or it can resist and face federal oversight. Your choice. It was a bluff partially. Park couldn't actually mandate all of those things without legislative action. But Walsh didn't know that. And more importantly, the cameras didn't know that. Walsh's political calculation was visible on his face. Resist and become the villain who values money over suffering. Cooperate and take credit for compassionate leadership. The math wasn't difficult. I'll bring the fee redirection proposal to the commission, Walsh said finally. We'll discuss it at next week's meeting. You'll do more than discuss it, Vivian said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms and knew exactly how to apply pressure. You'll recommend approval, and you'll explain to your fellow commissioners that the alternative is a very public fight over whether elderly poverty should be profitable. Are we clear? Walsh nodded stiffly, then retreated to his car with whatever dignity he could salvage. The press conference continued for another 30 minutes. Ruth answered questions about her experience about Thomas, about what she hoped the Alvarez Act would accomplish. Emma James and Marie added their voices. Judge Hale gave a carefully worded statement about the court's commitment to reform. Commissioner Nguyen outlined the state oversight process. Attorney General Park detailed the legislative timeline, and through it all, cameras captured everything. The tears, the strength, the raw exposure of people who'd been invisible finally demanding to be seen. When it was over, when the reporters had their footage and the crowd had dispersed, Ruth stood on the courthouse steps with Vivian, Emma James, and Marie. They were quiet, exhausted, wrung out from the emotional exposure. "Did we do it?" Emma asked. "Did we change anything?" "We started to," Vivian said. "Walsh will approve the fee redirection because it's political suicide not to. The protocols will be implemented. The Alvarez Act will move through the legislature. But the real question is whether it lasts, whether it becomes just another program that looks good on paper but fails in practice." Ruth thought about that, about the difference between symbolic change and real transformation. Then we keep showing up. We keep telling our stories. We become impossible to ignore, impossible to reduce to statistics. We make them see us every single day until seeing us becomes automatic. James nodded slowly. "I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of being ashamed. If showing up means someone else doesn't have to feel this way, I'll show up every day." "Me too," Marie said. "All of us," Emma agreed. They stood together, these four people who'd been broken by the same system, who'd found each other in their breaking, who'd discovered that shared suffering could become shared strength. Vivian's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and a smile spread across her face. "Naomi's story just posted online. It's already trending. The county switchboard is apparently overwhelmed with calls supporting the Alvarez Act." Ruth felt something loosening in her chest. Hope maybe, or vindication, or just the simple recognition that being heard was its own kind of justice. Over the next week, things moved with startling speed. The county commission approved the fee redirection in a unanimous vote, each commissioner eager to be on the right side of a story that had captured public attention. The court implemented the new protocols assigning social workers to assess elderly defendants before any fines were levied. Judge Hale's specialized housing and homelessness court held its first session, and Ruth attended, watching as a 70-year-old man charged with sleeping in a park was connected with emergency housing instead of being fined. The case review team worked through nights and weekends, examining 18 months of court records. They identified 247 elderly defendants who'd been fined for poverty-related offenses. Of those, 73 had outstanding warrants for unpaid fines. 81 had criminal records that affected their ability to find housing or employment. 49 had been jailed at some point in the process. Ruth called each one personally. Her voice became familiar to people she'd never met. A lifeline offering not just the vacation of their sentences, but the validation of their experiences. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Ruth Alvarez. I'm calling about your case." "Yes, that Ruth Alvarez. I want you to know that what happened to you wasn't your fault. The system failed you, and we're working to make sure it doesn't fail anyone else." Some people cried. Some were suspicious, convinced it was a scam. Some were so beaten down by the system that they couldn't believe redemption was possible. But Ruth persisted, patient and steady, because she understood that trust once broken by institutions took time to rebuild. Harbor Commons broke ground on a cold morning in late October. Ruth stood with Vivian Sarah Chen and a crowd of supporters as the first shovel bit into earth. The sign announced it clearly, future home of the Thomas Alvarez Senior Residence, where dignity lives. Ruth traced her fingers over Thomas's name, and for the first time since his death, grief felt like something other than drowning. It felt like purpose, like his suffering and her suffering, and all the accumulated pain of loving and losing had been transformed into foundation, into walls, into a home that would shelter others. "He'd be proud of you," Vivian said quietly. "He'd be proud of us," Ruth corrected. "All of us. The whole messy, impossible coalition of people who decided that enough was enough." Construction would take 9 months. In that time, the Alvarez Act moved through the state legislature, gaining momentum with each hearing. Attorney General Park testified. Commissioner Nguyen presented data. Judge Hale spoke about his own transformation. And Ruth, Emma, James, and Marie told their stories over and over to committees and subcommittees, and anyone who would listen. The opposition was predictable. Fiscal conservatives worried about costs. Law and order advocates concerned about being soft on crime cynics who believed that poverty was a personal failing rather than a structural problem. But the momentum was unstoppable, fueled by media coverage, public support, and the simple moral clarity of Ruth's question: what kind of society punishes people for being poor? By December, 3 other cities had reached out to Broward County, asking to replicate the model. By February, the state Senate passed the Alvarez Act with a strong majority. By April, the governor signed it into law, with Ruth standing behind him as cameras flashed and pens scratched signatures that would reshape how the state treated its most vulnerable citizens. Ruth kept working, kept showing up at Harbor Commons as it rose from the ground. She consulted on every detail, from the texture of the hallway carpets, soft enough to cushion falls, firm enough to support walkers, to the height of the garden beds, accessible to people in wheelchairs, manageable for arthritic hands. She interviewed potential staff looking for people who understood that caring for the elderly meant respecting their autonomy, their dignity, their lifetime of accumulated wisdom. And slowly, month by month, she watched her life rebuild itself. Not the old life that was gone, buried with Thomas on Maple Street, but a new life, one built on purpose rather than routine, on advocacy rather than invisibility, on the hard-won knowledge that systems only change when people refuse to be crushed by them. The efficiency apartment became less temporary. Ruth filled it with small things: a plant on the windowsill, photographs of Thomas on the walls, a chair positioned to catch the afternoon sun. She reconnected with her daughter, who cried when she saw her mother on the news, and apologized for not doing more, not seeing more, not being more. Ruth forgave her, because she understood that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes people are drowning in their own lives and can't throw lifelines. She made friends, real friends, not just acquaintances. Emma, James, and Marie became her inner circle fellow survivors who understood without needing explanation. They had coffee every Thursday morning at a diner downtown, swapping stories and strategies, and supporting each other through the ongoing challenges of rebuilding lives from rubble. And Ruth learned something she hadn't expected: that being seen, truly seen, was both terrifying and necessary. That vulnerability could be strength. That her story, painful as it was to tell, had the power to change not just policies, but hearts. On a warm day in June, 9 months after that morning in court, Harbor Commons opened its doors. The Thomas Alvarez Senior Residence stood 3 stories tall, brick and glass, and hope made tangible. The lobby was exactly as Ruth had envisioned: warm lighting, comfortable chairs, a coffee station, and windows that let in light without exposing residents to scrutiny. 72 apartments, each one designed for dignity. On-site medical clinic staffed 5 days a week. Community garden with raised beds and benches. Computer lab with patient instructors. Child care corner for grand families. Common areas that invited gathering without forcing it. And in the center of the lobby, a photograph of Thomas in his Marine uniform, young and strong, and full of the future he'd never get to live. Ruth's apartment overlooked the garden. She stood at her window on opening day, watching the first residents arrive with their sparse belongings and their heavy histories. And she thought about Judge Hale's laugh, about the plastic bag of documents, about the moment Vivian had walked through the courtroom door. She thought about how close she'd come to disappearing entirely, to becoming just another statistic, another forgotten elder, crushed by a system that valued efficiency over humanity. But she hadn't disappeared. She'd been seen, and being seen had changed everything. The garden was Ruth's favorite place at Harbor Commons, and she found herself there most mornings before the heat of the day settled in. The tomatoes were thriving, fat heirloom varieties that Thomas would have loved, their vines heavy with fruit that residents picked and shared like small miracles. Emma Rodriguez had claimed a corner bed for peppers, her arthritic hands moving carefully through the soil like she was rediscovering something she'd thought lost. James Butler grew herbs, their fragrance filling the air with memory and possibility. Marie Washington tended flowers, bright splashes of color that seemed to argue against every hardship she'd endured. Ruth was deadheading marigolds when she heard footsteps on the stone path behind her. She turned to find a woman in her late 60s standing there, uncertainty written across her face. Her clothes were clean, but worn, her eyes carrying that particular hollowness. Ruth recognized the look of someone who'd been invisible too long. "Are you Ruth Alvarez?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am." Ruth straightened her back, protesting the movement, and brushed dirt from her hands. "Can I help you?" "I'm Gloria Patterson. I saw you on the news back when you did that press conference. I've been on the waiting list here for 3 months, and they called this morning. Said an apartment opened up." She paused, swallowed hard. "Is it real? Is this place really what they say it is?" Ruth looked at this woman, this stranger who was also somehow herself 18 months ago, and felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. She gestured to a nearby bench. "Sit with me a minute, Gloria. Let me tell you what this place is." They sat together in the morning sun, and Ruth spoke honestly. She told Gloria about the medical clinic that treated residents like adults, not children, about the social workers who asked, "How can we help?" instead of, "Why didn't you plan better?" about the community meals twice a week, where loneliness lost some of its edge, about the computer lab where she herself had learned to video chat with her daughter, about the simple dignity of having a door that locked a bed that was hers, a future that extended beyond the next night's shelter. But she also told the truth about what Harbor Commons couldn't fix. It couldn't bring back the years lost to struggle. It couldn't erase the trauma of homelessness, the shame of being criminalized for poverty. It couldn't restore what the system had taken. It could only offer a foundation for rebuilding. "What it is," Ruth said finally, "is a place that sees you, really sees you. Not as a problem or a statistic or a burden, but as a person who deserves safety and respect and a chance to catch your breath. That's what this place is, Gloria. It's the chance to catch your breath." Gloria's eyes filled with tears. "I've been holding my breath for 3 years. Since my husband died. Since I lost our apartment. Since I started sleeping in my sister's garage because I was too ashamed to tell anyone I was homeless." "You don't have to hold your breath anymore," Ruth said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "Come on, Let me show you your apartment. They walked through Harbor Commons together, Ruth pointing out the features she'd fought for: the grab bars installed at the right height, the wide doorways, the kitchen with lowered countertops, the emergency pull cords that went to a staffed desk instead of an impersonal call center. Gloria's face transformed as they moved through the building. Hope replacing hollowness, like sunlight burning off fog. The apartment was on the second floor, a corner unit with windows that caught both morning and afternoon light. It was small, one bedroom, one bath, a combined living space and kitchenette, but it was whole, complete, home. Gloria stood in the center of the empty living room and turned in a slow circle, taking it in. I can really live here, for real. For real, Ruth confirmed. Rent's based on your income, utilities included. The lease is month to month because we know sometimes people need flexibility. And Gloria, you're not alone here. We're a community. We look out for each other. Gloria pressed her hand to her mouth, and sobs broke through, the kind of crying that comes when the body finally feels safe enough to release what it's been holding. Ruth moved closer, put a gentle hand on her shoulder, and let her cry. She understood that these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of a burden finally set down. When Gloria could speak again, her voice was thick. Thank you. Thank you for fighting for this. For people like me. People like us. Ruth corrected gently. I didn't fight for you, Gloria. I fought with you. Every person who lives here who benefits from the Alvarez Act, who gets assessed instead of fined, they're not recipients of my charity. They're proof that the fight mattered, that we mattered. She left Gloria to settle in and made her way back to the lobby. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny celebrations. Marcus, the young bailiff from that morning in court, was there in civilian clothes, volunteering his Saturday to help a new resident move furniture. He'd become a regular fixture at Harbor Commons, his conscience apparently still working overtime to make amends for his silence. Ms. Ruth, he called out, grinning. Come tell Mrs. Chen that her couch absolutely will not fit through that doorway. She won't believe me. Ruth smiled and went to arbitrate the furniture dispute this small, ordinary moment, feeling like victory. The weeks turned to months, and Harbor Commons found its rhythm. Residents decorated their apartments, hung photographs, planted more gardens. The medical clinic treated everything from diabetes management to depression. The nurse practitioner, understanding that health wasn't just physical. The social workers connected people with resources, benefits they'd been eligible for, but hadn't known existed. Legal aid for expunging criminal records, job training for those who wanted to work. Ruth coordinated it all, her title of resident coordinator expanding to encompass roles she'd never anticipated. Mediator, advocate, counselor, friend. She helped Mr. Patterson in 3B navigate the VA system to get benefits he'd been owed for 40 years. She sat with Mrs. Alvarez, no relation, in 1C, as she grieved her son lost to addiction and the streets. She organized a support group for residents dealing with the trauma of homelessness, and she attended every session, sharing her own story again and again, because healing, she'd learned, wasn't linear. The Alvarez Act rippled outward in ways Ruth hadn't fully grasped it would. Judge Hale's Housing and Homelessness Court became a model replicated in 17 counties. The mandatory needs assessments caught people before they fell through the cracks, connecting them with housing assistance, medical care, mental health services. The redirected court fees funded not just emergency housing, but prevention programs, keeping people housed in the first place. Attorney General Park's office tracked the data religiously, and the results were undeniable. Recidivism among elderly defendants dropped by 63%. Emergency room visits for housing insecure seniors declined by 47%. And the cost savings, the reduction in jail stays, emergency services, repeated court appearances, paid for the programs 3 times over. Ruth received the data in quarterly reports, numbers, and graphs that represented lives changed. Suffering prevented, dignity restored. But the real measure wasn't in the statistics. It was in Gloria's face when she picked her first tomato. It was in Emma's laughter during Thursday morning coffee. It was in James finding the courage to reconnect with his daughter. It was in Marie teaching her grandson to garden, showing him that grandma wasn't defined by one desperate act. A year after Harbor Commons opened, Vivian called Ruth to her office. The city sprawled below them through those floor-to-ceiling windows, beautiful and broken and full of possibility. We've had inquiries from 6 more cities wanting to replicate the model, Vivian said, pulling up a map on her computer. Portland, Sacramento, Austin, Charlotte, Detroit, Philadelphia. They want site visits. They want to talk to residents. They want you, Ruth. They want to hear from the person who lived it. Ruth studied the map, each city a pin representing thousands of invisible elders, thousands of potential Ruths. That's a lot of traveling for a 73-year-old woman. It is, Vivian agreed. But it's also a lot of impact. Your voice carries weight because you're not a politician or an advocate by profession. You're someone who survived and then refused to let that survival be meaningless. That resonates. Ruth thought about Thomas, about the values he'd carried home from Vietnam's service sacrifice. The conviction that some things were worth fighting for, even when you were tired, especially when you were tired. "I'll do it," she said. "But on one condition. Emma, James, and Marie come too. This isn't my story alone. It never was. We speak as a collective, or not at all." Vivian's smile was knowing. "I'll book 4 plane tickets." They became an unlikely delegation. 4 elderly people who'd been criminalized for poverty, now traveling the country as experts in systemic reform. They spoke at city councils and state legislatures. They consulted with architects and social workers. They met with other survivors, their stories creating a tapestry of shared experience that made the invisible impossible to ignore. In Portland, Ruth stood in a city council chamber and watched as they voted to establish their own version of the Alvarez Act. In Sacramento, she toured a proposed senior housing development and suggested changes that would make it a home rather than just a building. In Austin, she met with formerly homeless elders and listened as they shared strategies for survival. Their wisdom, hard-won and precious. Each city added something to her understanding of the problem and its solutions. Homelessness among seniors wasn't monolithic. It was shaped by regional economics, local policies, available resources. But the core truth remained constant. Every society makes choices about who matters, who's seen, who's worth investing in. And those choices, Ruth learned, could be changed. Judge Hale continued his transformation, becoming an unlikely champion for reform. He wrote articles for legal journals about judicial bias and the importance of context in sentencing. He trained other judges, his own failure becoming the teaching tool that helped others avoid the same mistakes. He visited Harbor Commons monthly, not as a judge, but as a student, learning from residents about the real-world impact of courtroom decisions. One afternoon, he sat in the garden with Ruth, both of them silent as they watched tomatoes ripen in the sun. "Do you ever forgive me?" he asked finally. "Truly forgive me?" Ruth considered the question. Forgiveness was complicated, she'd learned. It wasn't a switch you flipped or a gift you bestowed. It was a process daily and difficult of choosing not to let someone else's wrong consume you. "I'm working on it," she said honestly. "Some days are easier than others. Some days I hear that laugh in my head, and I get angry all over again. But then I see what you've helped build, not just Harbor Commons, but the whole system of change. And I think maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. Maybe it's about acknowledging that people can grow, can transform, can become better than their worst moment. Judge Hale nodded, his eyes wet. I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying to be better than that moment. I know, Ruth said. We all are. The second year brought new challenges. Funding was always precarious, dependent on political will that could shift with elections. Some cities that had expressed interest quietly backed away when the fiscal conservatives gained power. There were setbacks. A proposed expansion of the Alvarez Act failed in the state Senate, delayed for another session. A city that had promised to build senior housing redirected funds to other projects. But there were victories too. A national foundation reached out, offering grants to replicate the Harbor Commons model in 10 more cities. A documentary filmmaker spent 6 months at Harbor Commons, capturing the daily reality of rebuilding lives. When it premiered, Ruth watched herself on screen. Her weathered face, her arthritic hands, her steady voice, and barely recognized the woman who'd stood in that courtroom 2 years ago, trembling and ashamed. She'd found something she didn't know she was looking for. Not just survival, but meaning, purpose. The knowledge that her suffering had been transformed into something generative, something that would outlive her. Emma died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, peacefully in her apartment at Harbor Commons, surrounded by the peppers she'd planted and the community she'd helped build. The grief was sharp, and communal residents gathering in the lobby, sharing stories, crying together. Ruth spoke at the memorial, her voice breaking as she described Emma's courage, her refusal to be invisible, her insistence that dignity was a right, not a privilege. She was 71 when she died, Ruth said, looking at the faces gathered there. Residents, staff, advocates, friends. She spent 68 of those years being told she didn't matter, being overlooked, being dismissed. But in her last 3 years, she mattered ferociously. She changed laws. She changed minds. She changed the world for people she'd never meet. That's legacy. That's what it means to refuse to disappear. They buried Emma's ashes in the garden beneath a new pepper plant, and Ruth understood viscerally what she'd been building all along. This wasn't just about housing or policies or legislation. It was about creating spaces where people could matter, where their last years could be dignified, where their legacy could be more than survival. 3 years after that morning in court, Ruth stood in the White House. The president was signing a national version of the Alvarez Act, federal legislation that would require needs assessments for elderly defendants across the country, that would fund senior housing initiatives, that would finally acknowledge at the highest level that criminalizing poverty was both immoral and impractical. Attorney General Park was there, having been elevated to a position in the federal Justice Department. Commissioner Nguyen represented the coalition of state oversight boards. Judge Hale stood quietly in the back, his presence a reminder of how far the journey had traveled. Naomi Chen covered it for a national news outlet, her reporting having won awards and changed careers. And Ruth stood with James and Marie, Emma's absence, a presence they all felt as the president handed her one of the signing pens. Ms. Alvarez. The president said, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony and genuine respect. This legislation exists because you refused to accept that your suffering was inevitable, because you turned your pain into purpose. On behalf of a grateful nation, thank you. Ruth accepted the pen, and she thought about all the moments that had led here. The laugh in the courtroom, Vivian walking through the door, Marcus finding his voice, the press conference, the groundbreaking, Gloria's tears of relief, Emma's fierce advocacy, the thousands of faces she'd met in cities across the country, each one a story of survival and struggle. Thank you, Mr. President, she said. But this isn't my achievement. It belongs to every person who was told they didn't matter and refused to believe it. It belongs to every advocate who fought when fighting seemed futile. It belongs to everyone who looked at a broken system and decided that breaking it further wasn't acceptable, that we had to build something better. The cameras captured it all, and Ruth knew that her face would be on the news and papers shared across social media. But she also knew that by tomorrow, another crisis would dominate the headlines, another story would take precedence. The attention was fleeting, but the law was permanent. The change was real. The lives transformed were ongoing. Ruth returned to Harbor Commons, to her apartment overlooking the garden, to the community that had become her family. She was 74 now, her arthritis worse, her energy less boundless, her body reminding her daily that time was finite. But she'd learned that legacy wasn't about living forever. It was about making sure the change you fought for outlived you. On Thursday mornings, she still had coffee with James and Marie, and they still talked about Emma keeping her present through memory. New residents arrived regularly, each one carrying their own story of system failure and survival. Ruth greeted them all, showed them their apartments, told them about the garden and the clinic and the community. And sometimes when Gloria or Mr. Patterson, or any of the dozens of others whose lives had been changed, asked her how it happened, how Harbor Commons came to exist, Ruth would take them to the lobby and point to Thomas's photograph. "It started with love," she'd say, "with a man who deserved better than he got, and a woman who refused to let his suffering be meaningless. It started with a judge who forgot that cases are people, and a CEO who remembered that gratitude requires action. It started with a reporter who told the truth, an attorney general who wielded power justly, a commissioner who chose oversight over complicity. It started with all of us broken by the same system, refusing to stay broken." She'd pause, looking at their faces. These survivors, these fighters, these people who'd been invisible until they demanded to be seen. But mostly, it started with the simple recognition that dignity isn't a luxury we extend to people when it's convenient. It's a right we guarantee, even when it costs us. Especially when it costs us. Because a society that punishes poverty isn't civilized, no matter how efficient its courts or how balanced its budgets. And changing that, making dignity the default, instead of the exception, that's worth every fight, every setback, every moment of discomfort. 5 years after that morning in court, Ruth Alvarez sat in her garden at Harbor Commons, her arthritic hands gentle on tomato vines heavy with fruit, and she thought about justice. Not the justice of courtrooms and gavels and verdicts, but the justice of being seen, being valued, being given the chance to rebuild when the world has taken everything. The garden was full residents and volunteers, children and grandchildren, laughter and life. The building behind her housed 83 people who'd been invisible until someone decided they mattered. The Alvarez Act protected thousands more across the nation, catching them before they fell, offering services before punishment, choosing humanity over efficiency. It wasn't perfect. Systems still failed. People still fell through cracks. Suffering still existed. But it was better. Measurably, meaningfully better. And that Ruth had learned was how change actually worked, not in dramatic revolutions, but in steady, persistent, incremental transformation. Not in one person saving everyone, but in coalitions of broken people refusing to let their breaking define them. She looked at the photograph by her apartment door, the one of Thomas in his Marine uniform, young and full of futures he'd never live. And she smiled because his legacy wasn't in the house they'd lost, or the money they'd spent, or the years cut short by cancer. His legacy was here, in this garden, in these walls, in the simple revolutionary act of treating elderly poverty as a problem to solve rather than a crime to punish. His legacy was in every person who found shelter because someone decided that dignity mattered more than revenue, that context mattered more than convenience, that justice required seeing people in their full humanity. His legacy was in a system that, however imperfectly, had begun to bend. Ruth Alvarez stood up her knees, protesting her back, aching her body, carrying 75 years of living. And she walked toward the laughter, toward the community, toward the future she'd fought to build. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive on schedule, doesn't come when you need it, doesn't appear in the form you expect. Sometimes justice arrives because someone refuses to be invisible. Someone walks through a courtroom door at exactly the right moment, and an entire system is forced to confront the gap between what it claims to be and what it actually is. Sometimes justice is just people broken, imperfect, struggling. People deciding that their suffering will mean something, that their story will change the ending for someone else. That dignity is worth fighting for, especially when the fight seems impossible. Ruth had learned that lesson in a courtroom that laughed at her pain. She'd taught it to a nation that needed to remember. And now, in a garden blooming with second chances, surrounded by people whose lives proved that change was possible, she lived it every single day. The photo by her door would remain there long after she was gone, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts, performing CPR, walking through a door, refusing to stay silent, can cascade into movements that reshape the world. Not because one person was a hero, but because enough people decided together that the world as it was simply wasn't acceptable, and the world as it should be was worth building one protocol, one apartment, one moment of dignity at a time.